Hi, I'm Tom McMorran. I'm Assistant Superintendent and Head at School here at Joe Barlow High School, serving the towns of Easton and Reading, Connecticut. And I want to talk about the modern high school as a community of learners. But in order to do that, I'd like to start all the way back at the founding of the American colonies, when the Mayflower landed in 1620. There were a couple hundred people on that tiny little boat, and 41 of them signed a compact that they would live in a community of their own design, according to their own ideals and what they thought was just and free. And so an enduring message we have from the past is design communities where people can choose their own adulthood. But there were other people on that boat who had come to the United States, not what became the United States, for economic opportunity. They wanted land, they wanted to explore the wilderness, they wanted to grow for themselves their own lives. And when we look at the two kinds of people on that boat, we can see today the conversation we're having about American public education. On one hand, we have people who say the purpose of public education is to produce economically viable adults, people who can be slotted into our workforce. On the other hand, we have people who are saying the purpose of education is to produce a democratic population, people who know enough about the world and how it works to sustain the institutions that ensure our freedom. I think we need both kinds of people in our American economy and our American culture. And currently, those who are arguing in favor of economic viability have advanced the notion of common core state standards. They want to establish a common framework on which all curricula will be designed. And it sounds good. But there's a problem to it, one that I'm concerned about, which is if we look at history, we can find numerous examples, and I'll give you only two, of people who have said that they know what kids in the future need to know and be able to do. And the problem with that is that it's very difficult to predict what kinds of skills and knowledge people know in the future, particularly if we're doing it at the expense of those more broad, political, idealistic, virtuous notions of how to raise people for a democratic society. In 1486, a German priest named Heinrich Kramer wrote a book. And the book described what you needed to know and be able to do in order to keep your society safe. It was called Malleus Malefactorum, which translates in English to the witch's hammer. It was a guidebook on how to identify witches, so you could remove them from the population, mostly by hanging or burning. Now today we look back and we'd say, knowing what 1486 was like, could he really predict the Renaissance and the explosion of modern learning and science that was right around the corner? Just 20 or 30 years later, you have Gutenberg, and from Gutenberg, the modern era? No, you'd say that's ridiculous. So let me give you a different example. In 1818, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to his friend Burwell, in which he described the education of women in America, in the modern world of the 1800s. And he said three things in this letter. One is that you should keep women away from novels because novels was a trivial waste of their time. The second was that women should understand Latin so that at night they'd be able to discuss culture with their educated husbands. And the third was that they should really be skilled at needlepoint. And he included his own daughter in that list of how you educate someone. You see, because Tom Jefferson knew what women and other people needed to know or be able to do in the future. But he couldn't anticipate the Industrial Revolution at that time. So I think that there's a danger when we decide that we hold all the cards, that those in power, that those who are able to control curriculum design and national conversations have the confidence to say that they know what the future will bring. In fact, in 1932, a German turned American theologian at Columbia University, Reinhold Niebuhr, he wrote a book called Moral Man and Immoral Society. Now this is 1 year before Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. And he said, people in power have always denied full educational access to those who they consider to be socially beneath them, minorities, women, the disenfranchised, people who don't own property. And then they hold them accountable and blame them for their lack of education. In the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century, traditional American education has been about expanding opportunities. Opportunities so that one can join the economic workforce, but also so that one will be an active member of a democratic society. So we get to the early 80s and the impact of technology on education. And Neil Postman says in a book in 1982, The Disappearance of Childhood, that what makes us adults in a modern knowledge-based society is the ability to interact with literacy, to be able to read and write. So it makes sense to me today, as we live in this saturated world of high technology, that our kids do need to know how to read, how to be numerate, how to do other things. But we shouldn't presume that we know what the next 35 years will bring. In fact, reading all by itself is a radically odd behavior for a human being. We've been a species, Homo sapiens, for 200,000 years. 200,000 years ago, there were people that looked and acted and thought just like we did, but they didn't have the benefit of where we are in time and culture. 200,000 years. That's such a big amount of time to fathom that when I say that the printing press was invented 500 years ago, you go, well, 500 years, that's a lot of time to figure out how to be a literate society. But let's compress that down to seconds. Let's take 1 second for every one of those years. 200,000 years at 1 second per year is 55.5 hours. If the human species had popped into existence 55.5 hours ago, we've been trying to get everybody literate for no more than 8 minutes. And it's only in the last 20 seconds of that time frame that we've said everyone by the age of 14 will be literate and numerate. You cannot predict the future, and we are undertaking an incredibly noble and difficult task. So it seems to me that it's too early in the process for us to say we have the answers. We are going to articulate a common core of state standards, and those will tell us how to guide the future. Important, but not of primary importance. The United States of America holds two very important roles in the world at large. There's 7 billion people on the planet. There's 300 million of us, of whom about a third are working. 100 million people are the engine of the world's economy. It's our ingenuity, our creativeness, our willingness to take risks, our willingness to try that leads us to generate an economy that runs the world. And if we narrow in on test-based, high-stakes accountability for what we say our children need to know and be able to do, the real risk we're running is that we'll be producing highly efficient test takers who cannot continue that economic, ingenious Yankee know-how that runs the innovation of the modern world. But in addition to being the world's economic engine, we're also the hope of the entire world. We've traditionally said anyone can come here. Anyone can roll up their sleeves and do their best. You come for opportunity and personal freedom. That's what the Mayflower, that's what got those people from Amsterdam, where they had spent a decade, to the continent with the brazen hope that they could create a new world for everybody. And we've got to hold on to that vision of the future, and we've got to do it in the modern American high school. To do that, we have to look to our past in order to look to our future. So I would think the purpose of a modern American high school is to create a community of learners in which literacy and numeracy are, of course, integral to the inquisition that we take into all of the disciplines of learning. But we have to embrace them all. We cannot lose a single American when we make up 5% of the world's population. But we should look to the tradition of educating a liberal arts education for everyone. That means acquiring skills so we can pursue the true, the good, and the beautiful. And you say, how do you do that? And the part of the conversation that I think is missing in contemporary times, as we're wrestling through this education for economic viability, is the traditional education for virtue. How do you produce people who are willing to defend a democracy? Well, they need to have courage. They need to have temperance or control over their own bodies. Today we call it wellness. They need to have a sense of justice that is immutable, and they need to make good decisions. What we used to call that in traditional education were the cardinal virtues that you would grow into a community. What we call it today is something we're embarrassed to say out loud, that we care about the well-being of happy, autonomous American adults, and by that, the well-being of the world at large. So when we looked to the modern American high school, we should be a community working in partnership, the teachers, the students, and the families, in the support of the larger community for the well-being of us all. That's what Connecticut was founded on. That's what each of our states incorporated around. And we've forgotten that, I think, in the rush to give high-stakes tests. A community of learners is a partnership. It's a great place to be. It unlocks the potential of every kid so that every kid can grow into a contributing, well-contented, healthy, happy, balanced adult. That's what we're pursuing at this high school. And that's what I think other high schools should be pursuing also.